Hello friends, just about 6 weeks back, we at Republic brought to you a trailer of a documentary called BBC on Trial. Editor-in-Chief Arnab Goswami calls it the Boring Broadcasting Corporation, but obviously it is the British Broadcasting Corporation. And BBC has a history, a legacy, and goes back decades, going back before the World War II. And increasingly, we have found, particularly in India and many other geographies around the world, how BBC is seen as a tool of the British deep state, the Western deep state, in pushing certain agendas, certain narratives. And now we have this documentary, BBC on Trial, which I mentioned we released on our platform. And the full documentary has now come out. And the makers of the documentary are joining us today in this podcast. Welcome, Pandit Satish Sharma, author, fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, and London-based. Or with him, co-author, a former banker, and narrator in the documentary, Navita Vashisht. Welcome.
Namaskaram ji, Jai Shri Ram. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome again, and let's begin. And can I begin with a provocative question that are you suggesting through this documentary that BBC is a deep state tool with the British government or the larger West?
That really is a provocative question, and you've jumped right to the conclusion. We would like everybody to look at the evidence we've presented, and I think coming to that conclusion is unavoidable. We would not want to be in the position where we're saying, here's what you should believe. But the intention from the outset was to establish what is the BBC. Its charter says to inform, to educate, and to entertain. But we found increasingly, especially in the area of reporting on Hindus, and especially reporting on Bharat, and reporting on the politics, they were not informing, they were not educating, and they certainly weren't entertaining. And so what was it they were doing? For a long time I've been interacting with the BBC. Time and time again I've had cause to communicate with the senior levels and object and complain about individual acts of reporting. But the trend as we journey towards the election here, the trend in the BBC became more strident, more aggressive, and I felt it was interfering. And so we started to gather research that I'd been collating for a long period of time. And then we did more research. We wanted to know exactly who, what, and why. What was the actual policy of the BBC in reporting on issues connecting to us? And we discovered it was totally different to what we had thought. And that's really what prompted us to say, okay, we have to share this information. It's in everybody's interests that this be shared. And that gave birth to the idea of the BBC on Trial with the documentary.
Why do you call it BBC on Trial?
In my own professional training, I'm one of those people who has been trained to look at an output. What is an objective? At the end of this journey, what should the outcome look like? And so when I sat back and tried to visualize that, two things came to me. One, I thought no Indian, and especially no Hindu, should be paying a license fee to have their own children, their own civilization denigrated and harmed. So number one was there should be no license fees paid by us. But number two, the evidence that we had really pointed to the fact that this was an organization which had not been held to account, and it needed to be held to account. And the only place that I think it could be held to account adequately would be in a court of law. And so we compiled the evidence in the same way as one would compile a legal brief. And the idea of it being on trial is actually a hope and a vision. So I've had the pleasure of interacting with quite a few legal minds here in Bharat, and a number have come forward and said they would like to put the evidence that we have into a plea in front of the appropriate legal court, and let's see whether we can bring the BBC genuinely to trial.
So you mean to say it can actually lead to a legal process in India, if not in the United Kingdom?
Very much so, especially in India. This is where it should be. I would go as far as to say that we have presented enough evidence to support the assertion that the BBC is not a good faith actor. that it is not a neutral, unbiased broadcaster, that it has a particular lens, and whatever it looks at, it colours with that lens, and that lens is not neutral.
All right. So
in the documentary where we quote the first Director General, John Reith, and he's actually recorded the fact that the government should be able to say that they did not commandeer us, but they can trust us to not be truly impartial.
oh, that deep.
Yes.
Very Orwellian. Did you somewhere quote Orwell also in the documentary?
Indeed. In fact, when Orwell wrote his opinion about the BBC and how the longer he spent within the organisation, I think he wrote something along, one becomes more cunning and propaganda-minded,
Yes.
and an inclination to spread untruths becomes natural.
That's
So
right.
that was Orwell's remarks. And I think...
And his colleagues called it the liar's school of the BBC. So the training course that new recruits were put on, he likened it to a liar's school. So that's right at the very beginning.
I actually watched the documentary and I was amazed and a little intrigued that you're calling the chapter 1 as Liar's School. And why you say so? Is it because of the processes that the BBC follows in terms of its journalism and the practices that they have in-house, which make you believe that there is a lot of doctoring going into what is produced by the BBC, both in radio and on television?
Without doubt. The diaries of John Reith, the very first Director General, made it absolutely crystal clear. This was never set up as an organisation which was going to disseminate news. It was set up with the intention of reaching out to the English, the Scottish, the Welsh and the Irish, and members of the colonies, to give them a particular message. And the message was, be loyal to the British identity. And so that was always colouring it right from day one. And I think it's clearly stated in the diaries of John Reith himself. The news aspect came about in 1927, when it was given a royal charter. And as we know, with all of the royal corporations, the charters are so beautiful.
Yeah.
They are sculpted and encapsulate the highest moral standards, and they can be sort of brandished in front of everybody, whilst in the background there is a totally different game being played out. The BBC, according to their own records, was there to become a powerful tool for harnessing support from the colonies. Remember, we had over 2 million Indian origin soldiers fighting in World War II. That didn't just happen accidentally. That was one of the primary goals of the BBC, to reach out and recruit through its radio services huge numbers of foot soldiers who could then be engaged in the BBC's wars across the globe, the British wars across.
Right. So we'll go to the process in a bit. Please tell us, Mr. Sharma, what was the trigger? Was there an immediate trigger, a moment of epiphany, if I could, which made you think that maybe it's high time that you hold BBC to account, hold a mirror to them?
There was a catalyst. First, we are Hindus, and our tradition is always be part of a solution. We don't really want to be part of a problem. And so I had engaged with the Director General of the BBC about many of the smaller broadcasts that they'd done in the United Kingdom space. Issues where they had misrepresented caste, issues where they had denigrated the RSS and the HSS overseas, issues where they had repeatedly highlighted the worst parts of our history, whilst at the same time completely diminishing the best contributions that we have made to humanity's journey. So that was bubbling away in the background. And then I encountered the documentary, which they published in 2023, just before the run-up to the elections. So in 2022, just before the run-up to the elections. And that was so full of blatantly false accusations, presentation of data which they said, this is new. This is a revelation, a sting job was being prepared. But the documents that they had were blatantly false. In fact, Jack Straw, the Home Secretary, who allegedly gave them information which revealed that the 2002 Godhra riots, there was more in them than there actually was. Jack Straw is the same person who created the weapons of mass destruction file about Iraq. And the whole of the West went to war against Iraq on a British dossier. And so this was another dossier that they had produced, handed it to some people in the BBC who thought, right, we can use this to dig up everything about 2002. We won't mention any of the Muslim voices who came out in support of Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah, some from London.
London, and indeed many people who gave testimony to the Supreme Court trials here. They conveniently missed all of that. So there was no balance. And they emphasized the aspects of suffering of the Muslim community, completely ignoring the fact that the catalyst was the immolation of women and children who were coming back from a pilgrimage. That wasn't highlighted at all.
I would say you are softening the real impact of the tragedy when you say immolation. They were burnt alive and in a planned manner, and that conspiracy has been established by all agencies and upheld by the topmost judiciary in India. And for BBC to be playing around with those facts. The BBC to be playing around with those facts. So essentially what you're saying is that the personal targeting of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, got you thinking.
And it was broader than that because I recognized a deliberate intent to create conflict. It was the classic incitement. It was the classic polarization of a community and then creating a friction point and then pouring fuel onto that friction point. And it was just too coincidental that we're in the run-up to an election, a pivotal election. We have a large number of voters who were children in 2002 yes. and who won't have known the details of that journey and who are vulnerable to having presented to them a biased account. So I could see how this was going to be a trigger for a lot of conflict. And bearing in mind the terrible things that happened with the Delhi riots and so on, there is a tinderbox in some places. And the BBC, I thought, with this documentary, were actually lighting a fire and throwing in a small match which could have this problem.
Actually, in the documentary, you call BBC an agent of chaos and a platform which fuels hatred and violence. And perhaps what you're suggesting is that this documentary on Prime Minister Modi, twisting facts of 2002, is an example of that.
Absolutely. I mean, as we did the research, we were able to see how we talk about when Gaddafi was eliminated, that before that happened, there was a whole campaign of branding him as a mad dog of the Middle East. So it was negative, it was supposed to alienate the rest of the world from him, and that made it easier for them to justify the war campaign ultimately unleashed. And we felt the same thing, obviously, with Saddam Hussein. You know, he was the terrible dictator who had to be got rid of, supposedly under the guise of weapons of mass destruction. And we felt that groundwork was being prepared for Prime Minister Modi in the lead to the general election. And I think that ultimately that was the trigger point. Because before then, as members of the Hindu diaspora, you know, we always feel a little bit hot under the collar whenever the BBC talks about Hindus, because we know it's not going to be anything positive. But it was building up, and then that documentary was the last straw.
Right. Why you think this Hindu targeting happens, not just with the BBC, the manner in which even other Western media platforms, by the way, even ABC of Australia, they made a documentary on Prime Minister, again very biased, and India had to really tell them. Recently, France 24 did that. So in a way, it seems it's a concerted attempt at creating a certain picture of the Prime Minister, who's a very popular leader in the country, and perhaps they don't like it.
I think the evidence that we provide, and evidence which any serious student will unearth, supports the idea that the British have got too much to lose if Bharat becomes reconnected with its pre-colonization trajectory. For example, they have told the world they civilized this savage nation. And I've got records going way back to 1833, when in every church up and down the British Isles, Christian pastors were saying, we have to go into India and save their poor Hindu people from these terrible religious practices. So this is a long-running attempt to build a particular narrative. And the narrative, as Navita ji has said, is definable. First you build consensus. And once you have denigrated somebody to such a degree that they cannot occupy the moral high ground, and you're in the moral high ground, you can then justify any violence that's done to them. So hypothetically, had a tinderbox situation been created here in the run-up to the election, and then there was violence, it would be easy to point the finger at the BJP and the Prime Minister Modi and these terrible Hindutvadis, the right-wing fascists and all that nonsense that they have established, and then actually say, well, it was justified. They brought it upon themselves. We saw this same policy, by the way, being worked out in Leicester against Hindus, where there were no mosques attacked, but there were Hindu temples attacked. There were no Muslim homes attacked, there were Hindu homes in the hundreds attacked, continuously, days running. And yet the BBC reported Hindutvadi BJP activists on the streets of Leicester. So it's the same textbook, it's the same toolkit being leveraged again and again. But this time it seemed to be too serious, and we thought we have to do something. And the only thing to be done would be to establish the truth and then share it. One of my favorite quotes, St. Augustine from the Christian tradition, he said, the truth is too powerful, it doesn't need defending. All it needs is to be unleashed. And so we wanted to establish exactly what the truth was and unleash it. And as I say, when we let go of the leash, Republic was there to help us proliferate it, and it's really been an incredible journey so far.
And are you getting good response?
We have been, shall we say we've been surprised. One, it's a documentary, and documentaries don't really spark a passionate engagement. But the trailer itself, 5.5 million views, and we've just been watching it being shared in places that we had absolutely no expectation that it would be shared. I've had comments from people as far as California, from people in Africa, saying, this is incredible, when can we see the documentary and where can we see it? Here in Bharat, the response has been wonderful. Even today, I've had calls saying, please can we have a showing and a screening in Hyderabad, but we can't do it just yet because the state is a little unsettled. So the response has been absolutely marvelous.
Navita, since you were part of the scripting process, and you mentioned about Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and the manner in which a certain picture was sought to be created, I will go back to the Iran affair and the manner in which a coup was effected and the Shah was brought in, a democratically government was removed. So essentially, a dictator or a despot is good so long as that dictator or despot is serving the interests of the West, and if the utility is over, then the dictator becomes just that, a dictator. Did you sort of, have you in the documentary brought out examples of that kind to, in effect, basically just tell us the process you went through in terms of writing the script? Have you narrated, enumerated the instances where BBC has been a blatant tool of the Western and the British deep state?
Well, we covered Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, and we covered Mossadegh, which is the democratically elected ruler of Iran. And we uncovered the fact that a lot of the driving force behind that was to do with the oil. So in the Gaddafi's case, it was oil. In Iran, it was the position of the AIOC, which is now the British Petroleum. He had nationalized that corporation, and they wanted to be able to continue to plunder the oil. So a narrative was built around him, demonizing him, essentially using all the state apparatus of, the media, the clergy, the academia, and galvanizing public opinion against him so that it became easier to present they called it a revolution, but it was essentially a coup.
Yeah.
So we do go through that in the documentary and highlight how that was done. And, you know, we were worried that the similar telltale signs were becoming apparent in the case of India. And so, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to step in and try to point out that this is a playbook. And we don't want India to become a victim of it, or the latest victim.
I'm curious, you know, you mentioned about the Leicester violence and the manner in which it was sought to be colored in a certain manner. I believe earlier this year there were protests outside BBC headquarters, and perhaps rightly so, because the BBC won't call Hamas a terror organization. And the people came out. So it's not just the Hindus, it's the people there in London, in England and Wales and Scotland. They've started realizing perhaps that it's not value for money.
One of the surprising areas of support has been from the British Jewish community. And they brought evidence to us, and we had a look, and I've had conversations with the chief rabbi in the past, and the evidence was exactly the same. There were allegations made against the Jewish community in Britain that they had triggered a hostile response from Islamists, and it was their fault. But the recordings of the event made it crystal clear that there was no evidence that there had been any triggering actions from the Jewish community. And I've only a couple of days ago had a request from a prominent member of the Jewish community who has offered to host a screening for the Jewish community of the documentary. There is a template, Navita has touched upon it, but I think we being a community who seek harmony, it takes us a while to be able to understand minds which are actually really resource focused. All they want is the bottom line. And we've seen that time and time again. If there are resources that can be plundered, you need an excuse to be able to go in and to pick the pocket of that nation. And we saw it most graphically with what happened in Iraq. You know, we discovered that there were 42 regime change operations which had been conceived of and then executed by various British governments. We uncovered all of the facts to do with the intervention in Iraq, where Tony Blair was given a knighthood, and yet there were no weapons of mass destruction.
And they won't give knighthood to Robin Cook, who rebelled against Tony Blair and took a position that actually there are no weapons of mass destruction.
He has only just been released after languishing first in an embassy under siege and then in Belmarsh prison without any charges having been proven against him. And so there is I wanted to establish clearly that the BBC does not belong on the moral high ground. I remember Subhash Chandra Boseji, he made a remark once that the British have elevated sanctimony and made it into a weapon of war. That the attitude that they've adopted is so powerfully sculpted that they always seize the high ground and then rain criticism on everybody else.
And unfortunately, I mean, we have that very famous anecdote from our post-independence history when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was shot. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, who was outside Delhi, he wanted to hear it on the BBC before he could believe the information, and not his own, not India's public broadcaster. So, in a way, it's a success of the propaganda machine, and to a level where some very influential people, not just in India, perhaps around the world, believed that BBC is gospel truth. Why so?
We are people who are guided by heart. And I've encountered many people who, especially the older generation, who grew up in a time when they were emotionally attached to what the BBC was saying. And from our perspective, they were groomed. There is a manner in which you emotionally groom a person so that they respond to your triggers without scrutinizing those triggers in detail. And there are still people I know who are elderly in this community here in Bharat who are so loyal to the BBC, they cannot believe the truth behind what we have presented. One of the conversations we had was that we needed to present this in a manner that it wouldn't be triggering, that it wouldn't be emotional. So even those who are deeply emotionally invested could look at it and say, well, here's evidence. Here are facts. How do we now adjust our worldview and our view of what the BBC is according to these facts?
Yeah, so I think that's the reason why perhaps in the documentary you ask that while the BBC would do a Modi question, they would not do a documentary on the Churchill question and his role in the Bengal famine. But how do we go from here? Like, how do you take this forward? Like, you're saying BBC on trial. You mentioned how some people have approached you on whether they can take some parts of it and make it evidence before a court of law. You think that's the way to go?
I think so. When I thought this process through, I envisaged a courtroom and evidence being presented, and it struck me that we have been through a 1.5 year journey to understand exactly where the BBC is and what its orientation is. But it struck me that a judge presented with this evidence cold is more likely to say, one, I don't want to stick my neck out, and two, this is a little bit hard to believe. But the way in which the BBC works is it creates consensus first. If you're going to go into Iraq and you're going to steal all their oil, and all of a sudden Saddam Hussein's tons of gold are going to vanish, you need to be able to, one, build consensus so everybody is connectedly guilty after the event. And all of the nations who stepped forward and supported George Bush and Tony Blair in going in, they're all collectively guilty. Mm-hmm. They have that collective guilt for what happened there. But if you build the consensus, the likelihood of you getting away with it is better. So we realized that in order to have a chance for this evidence to be scrutinized fairly, we needed to build the consensus. So the documentary is helping to do that quite well. I think we will see in a very short space of time enough of a background environment which would make the prospects of a successful outcome in a trial much more successful, much more likely than if we hadn't had the document.
I hope so, because we have seen, for you, the Modi question was the trigger. We have seen the BBC playing mischief during a very crucial period after the abrogation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir in 2019, when they sought to push a video clip which was seemingly, if not outrightly doctored, but not relevant to the immediate moment. And then we have seen, and there is an ongoing investigation on the business side of the manner in which BBC has operated in India. Having said that, my last question to you, the real impact that can happen is if some change is brought in the manner in which the BBC is run. And that's completely in the domain of the British and the British establishment. You think your documentary is going to make any impact on that front in London?
I don't think so at all, because it's not in their interest. They have an investment in this voice, this trumpet which can reach every corner around the globe. They're not going to discard that. It's too powerful an implement. And so what I really think would be a useful development is if we address this from a decolonizing point of view. This notion that the BBC has the right to be able to enter into any space and then comment on it without actually looking at the facts, this notion we have to get beyond. It's a colonial notion. There is a clip in the documentary where we talk about Tariq Mansour, and he talks about white media's burden. And that is an entirely colonialist perspective. It's the white person saying it doesn't matter if it's academia, it doesn't matter if it's politics, it doesn't matter if it's news. I can go into there and I have a right, a self-granted right to be able to comment on it. So it's the worst village gossip that you can imagine. You know, sometimes I see the BBC, if you think of the global village, the BBC is that vicious little gossip whose own home is actually destitute and decrepit, but is going around home to home, whispering nasty, slanderous things in everybody else's ears and causing conflict so that some other member of the family perhaps can then go and burgle those homes. This is how the BBC is viewed in terms of the geopolitics and decolonization. The BBC has no authority and no role. It's already shall we say, abused its position as a good faith actor in Bharat. There is no reason for it to be here at all.
Right.
I would think the best development would be to have them ejected and denied access to the decolonizing consciousness of this nation. As it rebuilds itself from the trauma of what was inflicted upon it, it has no positive role to contribute to that.
Right.
And so we should be able to say thank you but no thank you, go home, put your own house in order.
Right.
And the documentary reveals the horrific litany of sexual abuse that the BBC has actively been covering up.
Right.
Whilst at the same time, it's broadcasting the Nirbhaya case with an unbelievably jaundiced lens.
Yeah.
So the solution to it is to find a legal process where it can be denied access to us as we heal. But I think it's more than that. I've had inquiries from Africa where they say we have the same feeling about these people. They come into our places and tell us what we should be. They tell us that our account of our own suffering is suspect. And I think that if we establish a good precedent here, there's no reason why other areas shouldn't also follow that suit. You know, when I saw Prime Minister Modi ji embracing the leadership of the African subcontinent at the G20, that was a trumpet moment. It was a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
We need to see the same.
The global south.
We need to see the same happening in the cultural, academic, intellectual, and emotional space.
Yeah, so it's been clear for a while to the discerning that BBC and similar platforms in the West have been colonial tools and essentially furthering colonial agenda. Hopefully the tribe might increase after your documentary, and if not throwing them out, maybe we can have our own agenda setting, counter-narrative building platforms globally. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Sharma and Navita.
There's no stopping an idea whose time has come. And I think Republic Global, their time has come.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was music to our ears.
Thank you so much. Very soon, God willing. Thank you so much.
Jai Shri Ram.